On the night every bride in England was supposed to be cherished, Eleanor Lillian Flynn sat alone in her candlelit bedchamber at Ashvale Park, still wearing her ivory wedding satin, listening to the clock strike midnight. Her husband, Duke Rowan Flynn, never came. Not that night. Not the next. Not for 3 long years. By the 3rd year, London had already judged her. They called her barren. They pitied the Duke. They whispered that such a fine man had married a woman who could not give him an heir. And Rowan said nothing. He let them blame his wife for a locked door that only he had ever touched. Then he did something worse. At the grandest royal gala of 1887, he arrived with another woman on his arm. But just as the ballroom accepted her humiliation, the doors opened again. The Duchess arrived, not weeping, not trembling. She entered in midnight blue silk, with her banker, solicitor, and the truth behind her. Because the shame had never been hers. It had always been his. And before that night ended, everyone who mocked her empty nursery would know why no child had ever come. But before we move on with the story, please remember to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's return to the story. The estate looked extraordinary that afternoon. Every window was lit. Every rosebush had been disciplined into presentation. 200 guests had come from London, from Edinburgh, from as far as Bath, and they had eaten cold salmon and warm opinions in equal measure. The wedding of Duke Rowan Flynn and Miss Lillian Maynard had been the season's greatest surprise. Rowan Flynn was 31. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that made junior members of Parliament straighten their spines whenever he entered a room. Half the eligible ladies of the 1883 season had set their caps in his direction. 3 had come embarrassingly close to achieving results. Then he had gone to a country dinner party in Westmoreland, sat beside a 23-year-old named Lillian Maynard, and spent the entire evening arguing with her about railway expansion before realizing, somewhere around the Pheasant Course, that he was desperately in love. Lillian was not conventionally fashionable. She wore her brown hair without ringlets. She had opinions about agricultural drainage. She had read on the origin of species and had actual thoughts about it. She was also warm, quick to laugh, and the kind of person who remembered servants' names without effort because she genuinely wanted to know them. Society was baffled by the match. The gossip columnists struggled to find fault with it, which annoyed them considerably. The wedding was magnificent. Lillian wore ivory satin with a veil that trailed 6 feet behind her. The flowers were white roses and stephanotis. The guests admired the flowers. The newspapers praised the match. The servants of Ashvale Park began placing friendly wagers on how quickly an heir would arrive, with the head housekeeper, Mrs. Clara Weber, giving favorable odds to before Christmas. Mrs. Weber collected no winnings. The wedding night came, and the Duke of Flynn did not enter his wife's bedchamber. Lillian sat on the edge of the bed until 1 in the morning, then 2, then 3, carefully not allowing herself to think what she was thinking. At some point the candles burned low enough that she had to light new ones. She did not call for her maid. She sat in the quiet and listened to the house settle around her and told herself that surely there was a reasonable explanation. The next morning, the Duke appeared at breakfast looking perfectly composed and explained that he had suffered from exhaustion on account of the wedding preparations. "Of course," said Lillian pleasantly and poured his tea. The night after that, he mentioned a persistent headache. "I would not wish to disturb you," he said, with elaborate courtesy. "I am very sturdy," Lillian replied. "Headaches do not transfer through proximity." Rowan looked at her as though she had said something terrifying and excused himself to review estate accounts. Within a fortnight, even Mr. Oscar Gordon, the butler, had stopped predicting anything cheerful. He confided to Mrs. Weber that something unusual was occurring, and Mrs. Weber replied that something unusual had been occurring since the wedding night, which was the understatement of the calendar year. The weeks became months. The months became the first year, then the second, then, with grim efficiency, the third. All this time, Lillian remained patient. She told herself that marriages found their rhythm in different ways. She reminded herself that Rowan was not unkind. He was distant, certainly. Reserved beyond all reasonable measure, undeniably. But he left interesting books on her breakfast tray. He remembered she disliked cloves and instructed the kitchen accordingly. When she mentioned wanting to visit the tenant farms, he arranged it without argument. He simply could not enter her bedchamber. And he could not, or would not, tell her why. What Lillian did not know, what she could not possibly have guessed, was that 4 years before their marriage, Rowan Flynn had been thrown from his horse during a fox hunting accident outside York. The fall had resulted in injuries the family physician had described, with much clearing of the throat and avoidance of eye contact, as potentially affecting certain prospects of fatherhood. The physician had used so many diplomatic euphemisms that it had taken Rowan 3 days to fully understand what the man was actually saying. He was 27 years old. He was a duke. Producing an heir was practically the definition of his occupation. And he had decided, in the particular way that proud, frightened men decide things, that the only acceptable response was to marry, say absolutely nothing, and hope the problem resolved itself through some combination of optimism and willful ignorance. It did not resolve itself. And so Rowan Flynn had built a wall between himself and the one person in England who might have helped him, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, year by year. Meanwhile, society counted months and found Lillian wanting. At Lady Bonnie Perry's autumn tea, the whispers began in earnest. 2 years, said one matron to another, behind a teacup roughly the size of her conscience. Not so much as a hint. I had heard, said her companion, that the Duchess appears perfectly healthy in every other respect. That is precisely what makes it so tragic. Lillian was sitting 12 feet away, admiring the centerpiece. Her face did not change. She had become very practiced at keeping her face in order. You are remarkably serene, said her friend Taylor Cole, who sat beside her and had the grace to be furious on her behalf. I would have overturned this entire tea service by now. What would that accomplish? Said Lillian. It would feel wonderful, said Taylor. It would accomplish their gossip getting worse and my gown getting wet, said Lillian. I prefer to be dry and correct. At home, alone, she allowed herself precisely 1 hour per month of genuine anguish. She would lock her sitting room door, sit in the window seat, and let herself feel the full weight of it, the loneliness, the humiliation, the grinding unfairness of being blamed for something nobody had bothered to investigate. Then she would wash her face, go downstairs, and be useful. It was during one such evening, in the autumn of her 3rd year at Ashvale, that she noticed the estate accounts seemed slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the sort of wrong that screamed at you. The sort that whispered, quietly, from the bottom corner of a ledger. She wrote a small notation in pencil. She told nobody. She kept it in the back of her mind, like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. She arrived the way beautiful complications always arrive, at a charity dinner, wearing black silk that managed to imply it had forgotten it was morning, escorted by nobody important, but noticed by everyone. Gloria Marsh was 28. She was recently widowed from a cotton merchant who had left her a house in Mayfair, an adequate income, and no inconvenient children. She had dark eyes, an excellent laugh, and the remarkable skill of making every man in a room feel as though he were the only interesting one present. Rowan Flynn met her at the St. Bartholomew's Hospital charity dinner in January, where she was seated 3 places to his left and managed to be seated next to him by dessert through a series of small social adjustments that everyone noticed and nobody mentioned. Your Grace, she said, with a smile that did not quite reach professional sympathy, but was within walking distance of it. I have heard so much about you. I should be afraid of that, said Rowan. You should be curious, she said. I have also heard about your difficulty. The fork in Rowan's hand became very still. He looked at her. She looked back, entirely unruffled. I beg your pardon, he said, in a tone that had ended conversations before. I am not here to judge you, she said quietly. I am here because I understand what it is to carry something you cannot explain to anyone. 3 days later, Rowan called at her Mayfair house. He told himself it was to address what she had implied. He told himself he would make clear that she had misunderstood, that there was nothing to misunderstand, that the entire matter was none of her business. He stayed for 2 hours. She never told him where she had learned his secret. He never pressed her. Later, he would understand this was one of the worst mistakes of his life. But in January of 1886, he was 33 years old and had been carrying his shame alone for 6 years, and she was the first person who had looked at him without either pity or expectation. It was intoxicating in exactly the way that wrong things are intoxicating. Within 2 months, Gloria Marsh had become the Duke of Flynn's constant companion in London. She appeared beside him at the opera, at the Hendersons' dinner party, At the races at Ascot, Lillian received polite notes explaining that her husband would be remaining in London for the week, then 2 weeks, then through March entirely. At Ashvale, the servants grew very careful around her. They set her breakfast tray with particular kindness. Mrs. Weber made certain the morning room was always warm. Oscar Gordon brought her the better morning papers before the Duke's London address could request them. Nobody said anything directly. They didn't need to. In London, society was saying everything. "It confirms what one suspected," said Lady Honoria Whitmore at a dinner on Grosvenor Square, cutting through her roast duck with decisive strokes. "If a husband looks elsewhere, the wife has given him cause." "Perhaps," said the man across from her, who was on his third glass of claret and feeling philosophical, "the cause lies closer to the husband." Lady Whitmore looked at him as though he had suggested something medically alarming. The conversation moved on. Lillian received a letter from her mother, Lady Macy Maynard, which began, "My darling girl, society is talking, and I do not wish to alarm you." But Lillian wrote back, "Dear Mama, I am not alarmed. I am occupied. Please do not worry." She was, in fact, occupied. She had returned to the estate accounts with fresh eyes and a sharper pencil. What had been a small discrepancy in autumn was becoming less small. The figures for the South Pasture rental income were down. The household account for London expenses was significantly up. The difference between what the estate farms should have produced according to the land agent's reports and what actually appeared in the bank records was, by Lillian's calculation, somewhere in the region of £400. She sent a careful letter to Mr. Kelvin McCullough, the family solicitor in Newcastle, asking whether any recent changes had been made to the estate accounting procedures. Mr. McCullough replied that he was not aware of any changes and that he would be happy to review the accounts at her convenience. She wrote back saying she would be in touch very soon. Then she went to the village school, read to the children for an hour, brought soup to old Mrs. Marsh on the Eastern tenancy, no relation to the widow, though Lillian occasionally enjoyed the irony, and came home to light her lamp and work until midnight. The tenants called her the Good Duchess. The servants called her that too, privately. London called her barren. She preferred the tenants' assessment. By the spring of 1887, Lillian Flynn had achieved a particular distinction. She had become the most publicly pitied woman in England without anyone noticing that she was, quietly, becoming one of the most capable. At Lord and Lady Ryland Weber's spring garden party in Chelsea, which she attended because propriety required it, and Taylor Cole dared her, she overheard 3 separate conversations about herself within 40 minutes. The first, "The poor creature. She looks well enough, but looks are not everything, are they?" The second, "I heard the Duke has been seen at Covent Garden twice this month with that widow." The third, delivered by a stout gentleman near the rose arbor who did not realize she was standing on the other side of it. If a man of Flynn's breeding married badly, that is one thing. But to be still without an heir in year 3, one begins to question the lady's fitness for the position. Lillian stood on the other side of the rose arbor for a moment, watching a bee navigate a particularly large bloom, and thought, "You are standing 5 feet from me, you pompous fool." Then she accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman, walked around the arbor, smiled at the stout gentleman, said, "Good afternoon, Lord Ashfield," and watched him go the color of his own waistcoat. Taylor appeared at her elbow. "That was magnificent." "It was nothing," said Lillian. "You have the composure of a general," said Taylor. "A general wins eventually," said Lillian. "I intend to do the same." She was not being poetic. She had spent the previous fortnight in Newcastle with Mr. McCullough, going through 3 years of estate records with the sort of attention usually reserved for parliamentary audits. The picture that emerged was not pleasant. The discrepancies were not accidental. Someone had been making systematic adjustments to the accounts, moving money from estate rental income into a separate account controlled not by the Duke's family bank, but by a private banking house in Leeds that McCullough had never heard of and could not initially identify. More troubling still, the instructions for these transfers bore the counter-signature of Sam Hendricks, the Duke's closest advisor, who had served as estate manager for 11 years and was considered, by everyone who knew him, to be entirely trustworthy. Everyone, it turned out, had been making the same mistake about trustworthiness. There was more. McCullough, once alerted, found that several of the estate's most profitable agricultural leases had been quietly renegotiated over the past 2 years, renegotiated downward, in favor of tenants who, on closer examination, turned out to be names Lillian did not recognize, connected to an address in Leeds that appeared, with depressing predictability, to be the same address as the private banking house. "This is fraud," said McCullough, setting down the papers with the expression of a man who wished he had entered a different profession. "Yes," said Lillian. "I know. Your Grace, this is a matter for—" "I need more evidence first," she said. "Names, bank records, witnesses. I want it to be complete before we do anything." McCullough looked at her over his spectacles. He had been a solicitor for 34 years. He had handled estate matters for earls, viscounts, and one extremely difficult baronet. He had never been instructed to build a case by a duchess who looked as though she had personally reviewed every invoice in the file. "Very well," he said. "How would you like to proceed?" "Carefully," said Lillian. "And quickly." Meanwhile, in London, Sam Hendricks was advising the Duke on the wisdom of purchasing an additional string of racehorses, renovating the London Townhouse Entrance Hall, and hosting a series of dinners that served wine at a price that made McCullough's eyes water when he later reviewed the receipts. Every extravagance reduced the estate's liquid capital. Every reduction made it harder for anyone to notice where the money was actually going. Gloria Marsh attended several of these dinners. She sat on Rowan's right and laughed at Hendricks's jokes and showed no visible sign that she was aware of the arrangement, which was, McCullough would later confirm, absolutely not the case. In the autumn of 1887, Lillian visited the estate's tenant farms and discovered something that the land agent had apparently forgotten to mention in his reports. 3 of the farms were operating at a profit significantly higher than recorded. The tenant farmers themselves, good men, honest men, the kind who looked you in the eye, told her, with some confusion, that they had been making their payments in full. They produced their own records. The figures did not match the estate ledgers. "When did this begin?" Lillian asked Mr. Jesse Kane, the oldest of the tenant farmers, a man with the sort of face that had been out in wind and rain for 60 years and was none the worse for it. "About 2 years back, Your Grace," he said. "New ledger forms came down from the house. Different format. We just filled in what we were told. Did you keep your copies?" "Every one of them, Your Grace." He paused. "Something wrong." "Not with you," said Lillian. "Not in the slightest." She collected his copies. She visited 4 more farms. She collected theirs too. She took them back to McCullough and said, "Add these to the file." McCullough added them to the file and ordered a rather strong cup of tea. 3 months before Lillian discovered the tenant farm records, she had done something else entirely. She had invested money. Not the estate's money. Her own. The small inheritance her grandmother had left her. £1,200, sitting quietly in a personal account she had opened on her own initiative the year after the wedding, because she had always felt, without being able to explain it precisely, that a woman ought to have something that was entirely hers. She had invested it in the Northeastern Railway's 3rd expansion bond issue at 5% per annum, on the advice of an article she had read in The Economist and confirmed with 2 independent financial sources. By the spring of 1886, the return had been reliable enough that she invested a further £400 in a coastal shipping venture operating between Newcastle and Hull, organized by a firm called Wyatt and Associates, whose principals McCullough confirmed were legitimate, solvent, and not connected to anyone in Leeds. The shipping venture returned 7% in its first full year. In January 1887, Lillian visited the offices of Wyatt and Associates personally. The senior partner, Mr. Chris Wyatt, was a compact, brisk man of 50 who had built his business from a single cargo brig and 2 employees in 1871. He received her in his office with the politely suppressed surprise of a man who had not expected a duchess to arrive unaccompanied and immediately begin asking precise questions about cargo insurance frameworks. Within 15 minutes, the politeness had become something considerably more engaged. "You have reviewed our last 4 quarterly statements," he said, looking at her across his desk. "Yes," said Lillian. "You noticed the anomaly in the 3rd quarter insurance column. It resolved itself by the 4th quarter. I assumed you had renegotiated the Hull contract." He stared at her. "We had. It is not noted in the statements." "No," she agreed. "It was implied by the variance." Chris Wyatt leaned back in his chair and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your Grace, I have a proposal I have been developing for 6 months. I have shown it to 3 gentlemen investors and received 3 polite expressions of caution." "Show me," said Lillian. The proposal was for a combined shipping and agricultural processing venture, a cold storage and distribution partnership between the coastal shipping routes and 3 major agricultural regions in the north of England. The logic was impeccable. The capital requirement was substantial. "How much?" said Lillian. £3,000 to establish the first storage facility. Another £2,000 for the distribution contracts. Lillian did not have £5,000. She had, at that moment, approximately £1,400 remaining in her personal account. "Give me 60 days, she said. She went home and thought for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to her friend Taylor Cole, whose late father had been a Liverpool shipping merchant, and whom Lillian knew had inherited a very considerable estate that she managed with considerable competence and what Taylor described as cheerful aggression. She explained the proposal. She attached the figures. She asked Taylor's honest opinion. Taylor's reply arrived in 4 days. "Lillian, this is excellent. I want in. How much do you need?" They combined their resources. They brought in a third partner, a quiet, careful widow named Lady Gloria. Lillian paused. Not that Gloria. A different investor entirely. She did not need irony in her financial ventures. The investment group she assembled involved Taylor Cole, herself, and a Newcastle merchant banker named Mr. Eric Gordon, who had been introduced by McCullough and who specialized, as it happened, in exactly the kind of railway and shipping intersection that the Wyatt proposal required. By summer 1887, the cold storage facility in Sunderland was operational. By autumn, it had turned a profit. Lillian's personal account now held £4,600. The estate's secret thief had no idea it existed. Neither did the Duke. During this same period, she had also found, while reviewing old household papers, a box of letters she had not known existed. They were Rowan's, written before their marriage, during the year he had spent in correspondence with her father while arranging the match. She had expected formal legal language and property schedules. Instead, she found this, in Rowan's handwriting, dated November 1883. "Sir, I understand that in matters of this kind, the conventional procedure is to outline the material advantages of the arrangement and trust that sentiment will manage itself in due course. I find I am unable to write such a letter. Your daughter argued with me for 4 hours last Thursday about the Birmingham rail expansion and was entirely correct, which I found deeply alarming and rather wonderful. I should very much like to spend the rest of my life being argued with in that manner, if she will have me." Lillian read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully, placed it back in the box, and sat for a long time looking at the window. He had loved her. He had genuinely, sincerely loved her. And he had let shame eat that love from the inside like rust eating iron, until all that remained was the shape of a marriage with nothing living inside it. She pressed her thumb against the corner of the letter until the edge left a mark on her skin. Then she picked up the estate fraud file and kept working. Because love was one thing, truth was another. And right now, truth was the only thing that would save them both. The invitations to the Duke of Whitmore's autumn gala had been sent in October on cardstock thick enough to serve as light building material, and accepting one was, socially speaking, non-negotiable. For 100 guests. The Prince of Wales was rumored to be attending. The orchestra had been brought from Vienna. Duke Rowan Flynn arrived at 8:15, which was fashionable without being aggressive about it. He wore his decorations. His dark hair was impeccably arranged. He looked, by every external measure, entirely in control of his life. Gloria Marsh arrived on his arm in burgundy silk. The ballroom received them. People turned. Heads tilted. Fans lowered. The particular silence of a room choosing not to comment, while commenting entirely through silence, settled over the first 50 feet of the hall. Rowan told himself it was fine. He told himself Lillian would not come. She never attended London events anymore. She was in Northumberland, managing the estate, which she seemed to find perfectly fulfilling and which freed him from the particular discomfort of being in the same room as someone he had wronged without ever having a vocabulary for why. "She won't be here," said Gloria, reading his expression with the accuracy of someone who had made it her occupation. "I know," said Rowan. Then stop looking at the door, said Gloria. He looked at her instead and tried to feel whatever he was supposed to feel, and noticed, not for the first time, that he felt primarily tired. At 8:40, the orchestra was playing a Strauss waltz. Sam Hendricks had arrived and was making his way toward them through the crowd with a glass of champagne and the satisfied expression he wore when things were proceeding according to plan. At 8:42, the ballroom doors opened. The footman announced, "Her Grace, the Duchess of Flynn." The waltz did not stop, but it became slightly uncertain, like a man walking confidently who suddenly notices the ground has changed beneath his feet. Lillian entered Whitmore Hall wearing midnight blue silk and the diamond necklace that had been in the Flynn family for 4 generations and which had sat in its box in Ashvale's vault for the entirety of her marriage because she had never been given occasion to wear it. She wore her brown hair in a style simple and precise that looked as though she had not tried particularly hard, which meant she had tried extremely hard. Behind her, in a composed and deliberate line, Mr. Kelvin McCullough, solicitor. Mr. Chris Wyatt, investment partner. Mr. Eric Gordon, merchant banker. 2 uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police. And, bringing up the rear with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment for approximately 18 months, her friend Taylor Cole, who had dressed for the occasion in emerald green and was making no effort to conceal her satisfaction. The room froze. Not metaphorically. People actually stopped moving. Gentlemen who had been mid-bow remained at 45 degrees. Ladies who had been raising champagne glasses kept them suspended. The orchestra finished its phrase and did not immediately begin another. Rowan Flynn saw his wife enter his London social world with the calm authority of a military commander, followed by professionals, followed by law enforcement, and felt his stomach drop through the floor of Whitmore Hall and continue downward at significant speed. Gloria Marsh felt something different. She felt the specific cold clarity of a person who has underestimated an opponent and is now watching the consequences arrive in evening dress. "Good evening," said Lillian, to the general room, pleasantly. She did not look at Rowan yet. She looked at Sam Hendricks. Hendricks's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, in a carrying voice, because the room was so quiet it would have carried even if she'd whispered. "I wonder if we might address a matter of estate business." "Your Grace," said Hendricks, "this is hardly £3,800 in 1885, said Lillian. "Transferred to a private account in Leeds. Another 2,200 in 1886. A further 4,000 and change this year, through the renegotiated farm leases. Shall I continue?" The room, 400 people, the cream of London society, several members of Parliament, and at least 1 cabinet minister, was absolutely, perfectly silent. McCullough stepped forward and presented a leather document case to the nearest senior officer. "The evidence is complete and documented," said McCullough, to the officer, in the tone of a man who had been a solicitor for 34 years and had never been more professionally satisfied. "Bank records, transfer instructions bearing Mr. Hendricks's signature and countersignature, tenant farm records showing the original payments alongside the adjusted estate entries, and the registration documents for the Leeds banking house showing the beneficial owner." "Beneficial owner," said one of the cabinet ministers, despite himself. "Mrs. Gloria Marsh," said McCullough. The room turned to look at Gloria. Gloria went very still. Then she said, with remarkable composure, "This is absurd. This is a fabrication by a jealous. The Leeds banking house is registered to a Gloria A. Marsh, widow, of 14, Mount Street, Mayfair," said McCullough. "Your address, Mrs. Marsh, I believe. The registration date is April 1885, which is approximately 2 months after your first meeting with the Duke." The room looked at Gloria again. Then it looked at the Duke. Rowan had not moved. He stood in the middle of the ballroom at the grandest social event of the season, and the floor kept descending, and none of it was showing any signs of stopping. Lillian finally looked at him. "Rowan," she said, quietly, in a voice that was not unkind, "I have something else to tell you. In front of these people, because they have been making assumptions about me for 3 years, and they deserve to have the correct information." He said nothing. He could not have spoken if he had tried. "I visited Dr. James Aldridge at the London College of Physicians in September," she said. "I went to understand, finally, why our marriage had never been a true one. He reviewed the original physician's report from your riding accident. The one from 1880. Rowan's jaw was a hard line. His hands were absolutely still at his sides. Dr. Aldrich believes, said Lillian, that with appropriate treatment, the condition described in that report was almost certainly manageable. He said, and I will give you his exact words, because they matter. It is a pity that the patient never sought a second opinion, as outcomes in cases of this nature are generally quite favorable with proper intervention. She paused. The empty nursery was never my failure, she said. It was the result of a secret carried by a man too ashamed to ask for help. I want London to know that. Every person who whispered about me deserves to know that. Nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The cabinet minister cleared his throat. The officer placed a hand on Hendricks's arm. Gloria Marsh took one step toward the door and was met by the second officer, who was politely implacable. And Rowan Flynn stood in the middle of Whitmore Hall looking at his wife and felt, with absolute clarity, the full weight of every choice he had made over 7 years, arriving all at once, like a bill long overdue. The scandal lasted exactly as long as London scandals last, which was roughly 4 months at full intensity and another 6 at declining interest. Sam Hendricks was arrested that same night and charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. His trial at the Old Bailey the following spring drew large crowds and produced, ultimately, a sentence of 7 years hard labor. Gloria Marsh was not charged criminally, as the accounts were registered in her name, but the authorization had been Hendricks's. She was, however, named in the civil proceedings through which the Flynn estate recovered the majority of the stolen funds. More relevantly, she was named in every newspaper in London. She retired from society the following month and was reported to have relocated to the continent. Nobody went to see her off. Rowan Flynn did not appear in public for 6 weeks following the gala. When he did, he appeared at Ashvale Park, not in London, arriving on a Tuesday morning without advance notice, which caused Mrs. Webber considerable logistical distress, but which she managed with the composure of a woman who had been managing this household for 20 years. Lillian was in the South Garden when he arrived. She was overseeing the installation of a new greenhouse, arguing pleasantly with the contractor about the pitch of the roof. She heard the carriage and turned. They looked at each other across the garden path. I did not ride ahead, said Rowan, which was perhaps the least adequate sentence he had ever produced, and he had produced several. No, said Lillian. I was not sure you would see me if I did. That was sensible reasoning, she said. He took a breath. May we speak? She studied him for a moment. He looked terrible, actually, not disheveled. Rowan Flynn could not manage disheveled if he tried. But there were lines around his eyes that had not been there in September, and the particular tightness around his jaw that she had come to recognize, over 7 years, as the outward sign of a man fighting himself. Come in, she said. They sat in the library, because it was the room with the most books and therefore, Lillian had always felt, the least likely location for anyone to say something stupid. She poured tea herself, because Mrs. Webber had been tactfully absent. Rowan sat with the teacup in his hands and said nothing for a while. Then he said, I owe you an apology so large I do not have adequate words for it. Begin with whatever words you have, said Lillian. We can address the inadequacy after. He set the cup down. He looked at her directly, which he had not done consistently for years. In 1880, he said, I believed I was told, that the accident had destroyed any hope of children. I was 27. I was about to enter the marriage market. I was terrified. He paused. I was a coward. You were frightened, she said. I let you be blamed for something that was my fear and my silence. Yes. I let a woman I did not love use my secret to steal from my own estate because I was too ashamed to let my wife know the truth. Yes. He stopped. His hands tightened on his knees. I watched you be humiliated in front of all of London, year after year, and I said nothing, because to speak would have meant admitting what I was. What were you? She said quietly. Ashamed, he said. Afraid. Selfish. And, he stopped again. And still in love with you. The entire time. Every ridiculous, inexcusable moment of it. Lillian looked at him. She looked at the hands clasped hard on his knees. She looked at the way he held himself like a man braced for a verdict. She said, that letter you wrote to my father. In November of 1883. He blinked. You found that? I found it. A muscle moved in his jaw. Then you know I was not lying about that, at least. No, she said. You were not lying about that. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea, which was her equivalent of taking a breath. I am not going to forgive you in an afternoon, she said. What you allowed to happen to me, what you chose to allow, that is not something that resolves over one cup of tea. I know. But, she said, I am not inclined to waste what might still be recoverable. She looked at him steadily. Will you go and see Dr. Aldrich? He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. Will you be honest with him? Entirely. Yes. And will you be honest with me? Going forward. About all of it. Yes, he said. I will. I swear it. She nodded slowly. Then we will begin there. They did not begin with romance. They began with truth, which is the only foundation that holds. Through the winter of 1888, they developed the habit of breakfast together. Not dramatic breakfasts. Quiet ones. He read the financial papers and occasionally read bits aloud when he thought she would find them interesting. She described the estate accounts, which she had reorganized entirely and which were now, under her management, performing better than at any point in the previous decade. He listened with real attention, not polite attention. There was a difference, and she noticed it. By spring, they walked in the evenings. By summer, they had begun to argue again about the grain prices, about the new school she wanted to build in the village, about whether the east wing needed repainting before or after the roof repair. He held his own in these arguments, and so did she, and both of them felt better afterward than they had during the pleasant silences. In September 1888, Rowan completed his third appointment with Dr. Aldrich. He came home that evening and found Lillian in the library. The doctor believes, he said, standing in the doorway, that the prognosis is considerably better than the original assessment suggested. She looked up from her papers. He says, Rowan continued, carefully, that with the treatment he is recommending, there is every reason for optimism. They looked at each other. Well, said Lillian. Yes, said Rowan. She closed her ledger. Sit down, she said. He sat down, and after a while, they had something resembling an honest conversation about hope, which was, for both of them, considerably more frightening than arguing about grain prices. They were married again, in the sense that mattered. Their son, Edward Rowan Flynn, was born in July of 1890. He weighed 8 pounds and announced his arrival with impressive volume and showed no signs of becoming quiet about anything thereafter. The same women who had whispered about Lillian's barrenness now said they had always believed in her. The countess who had once remarked that perhaps the Duke deserved a more fruitful wife was observed at a Kensington tea party in August 1890 claiming to have been a particular admirer of the Duchess from the very beginning. Remarkable, said Taylor Cole, standing beside Lillian at said tea party. Predictable, said Lillian, watching over the rim of her teacup. A daughter, Rose Margaret Flynn, followed in 1892. She was smaller than her brother, quieter by nature, and observed everything around her with large dark eyes that looked, Mrs. Weber said privately, precisely like her mother's. The estate, under Lillian's management, and with the fraud fully resolved and the stolen funds recovered, had become the most solvent it had been in 40 years. The Wyatt and Associates partnership expanded to 3 additional storage facilities. The railway bonds continued to return. A new school was built in the village, a proper one with 2 teachers and a lending library attached, which the children used with enthusiasm and the adults used on Tuesday evenings when they thought nobody was watching. Tenant farm income increased when Lillian personally reviewed every lease and renegotiated the ones that had been adjusted downward by Hendricks. Mr. Jesse Kane, when she delivered his new agreement, looked at the figures and then looked at her and said, Your Grace, this is more than fair. It is what was always owed, she said. He nodded with the gravity of a man who understood the difference between those two things. Ashvale was always finest at Christmas. Mrs. Weber had been saying this for 20 years, and she was correct. The house took on an air in December that it managed at no other time. Something about the combination of the candles in all the windows, the greenery on the staircases, and the particular smell of pine and beeswax that settled into the stone rooms and made them feel like something worth keeping. In December 1894, the main hall held a Christmas party that Lillian had been planning since September. Not a grand London affair. A family and estate gathering. Tenants, staff, neighbors, the children of the village school, and 24 friends who had never stopped believing in her during the years when belief had required some courage. Taylor Cole arrived from Liverpool with her 2 nieces and a crate of excellent port she said was a house gift, and which she was clearly intending to help consume. Mr. Wyatt came with his wife. Mr. McCullough came with the expression he reserved for occasions he found more enjoyable than he was prepared to admit. Edward, now 4, had been placed in velvet and had immediately gotten pine resin on it. Rose, at 2, was being carried by her father with the alert proprietary air of a small person who knew exactly where she wanted to be. Rowan Flynn, at 41, was a different version of the man who had stood frozen in Whitmore Hall 7 years earlier. Not entirely changed, he was still quieter than the room, still the kind of person who stood slightly apart and watched rather than performed. But the tightness was gone. The guarded, hunted quality that had lived in his jaw for years had left. He had earned its absence. Slowly, with considerable effort, without complaint. After dinner, when the children had been brought to the hall to see the decorations and then removed by well-timed nursemaids before full chaos could develop, the adults gathered around the great fireplace with their port and their general goodwill. Someone, it was Taylor, because it was always Taylor, said, "You know, I am going to ask the question everyone is thinking." "Please don't," said Rowan, without looking up from his glass. "What is the secret," said Taylor, addressing Lillian directly, "of how you 2 managed to end up here, specifically, when the road to here was so extraordinarily— what is the word I want?" "Catastrophic," said Mr. McCullough helpfully. "I was going to say circuitous," said Taylor. Lillian looked at Rowan. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was specific to people who have been genuinely broken by each other and have, through sustained and honest effort, become something stronger in the repair. "Honesty," said Lillian. "Honesty would have been considerably cheaper." The room erupted. Even Rowan laughed, which was, Taylor Cole later said, the best sound she had heard all year. Later, when the guests had gone to their rooms and the fire was low and the children were asleep, Lillian and Rowan sat together in the library. Their library, the one with all the books where honest conversations had begun, where the first careful breakfasts had been proposed, where she had once found his letters to her father and wept alone. He was looking into the fire. "I think about it," he said, without preamble, because they had long since stopped requiring preamble. "What it cost us. How different it might have been." "It might not have been different enough," said Lillian. "We were both very young. You were frightened. I was too trusting. Perhaps we needed the years to become people who could actually do this correctly." "That is generous," he said. "It is practical," she said. "Generosity implies sacrifice." "I am not sacrificing anything. I am telling you what I actually think." He looked at her. "I believe you," he said. "I did not always. But I do now." "I know," she said. "That is why I can say it." She picked up her book. He picked up his. The fire settled. Snow fell outside the library windows, soft and steady, covering the gardens and the east wing and the tenant farms and the road to the village where the school stood with its lending library, covering Ashvale Park in the particular white quiet of a December night in the north of England, which softens everything and makes even the oldest stone walls look as though they have been there forever and plan to stay. Upstairs, Edward was dreaming something noisy, because he always did. Rose had one hand wrapped around the bar of her crib, holding on, which Mrs. Weber said was entirely characteristic. Downstairs, the Duchess of Flynn turned a page. The Duke of Flynn watched the fire and did not feel the need to say anything further, which was, in its own way, one of the most significant accomplishments of his life. He had learned, at great cost, what should have been the simplest lesson available, that the woman beside him had always been the answer. From the very first evening in Westmoreland, over an argument about railways, when she had been entirely correct and he had found it deeply alarming and rather wonderful. He had been right about that, at least. It had taken him the better part of a decade to be right about the rest. But here, at the end of a Christmas evening in 1894, with 2 children asleep upstairs and snow at the windows and a fire burning warm and his wife reading beside him, here was what truth looked like when it finally came home. It did not look dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply stayed. This story is about what pride costs and what honesty saves, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to be defined by someone else's secret. Lillian Flynn was blamed for an empty nursery she had no part in creating. She was pitted, whispered about, publicly humiliated, and quietly excluded. She responded by becoming financially formidable, legally prepared, and personally unbreakable. She did not do it to punish her husband. She did it because the truth was worth carrying, even when nobody was helping her carry it. And when the moment came, in the ballroom at Whitmore Hall, in midnight blue silk and diamonds, she did not weaponize it. She simply told it. And the truth, as it always does when given room to breathe, changed everything.